Okay, welcome to the Health Path podcast, Dr. Tafur. It's a real pleasure to be able to speak with you.
Yeah, thank you very much. Thanks for having me on here, Alex. It's wonderful to be here with you.
Yeah, no, I've been looking forward to this conversation. I think it's taken us maybe a couple of months to kind of get something in the diary. And I was just saying off air, your book, The Fellowship of the River, was one of the first books I read, kind of sort of on psychedelics ultimately, and it kind of really opened my eyes and I guess kind of shifted me in regards to my trajectory with some of the training that I'm now doing. So before we kind of dive into some of that, are you just happy to share a little bit of your backstory, who you are, what you're doing, what you've done for the listeners that aren't yet familiar with you?
Yeah, right. Well, I'm Dr. Joe Tafur. I'm a physician, family physician here in the United States. I'm Colombian American. My family's from Colombia, South America. And so just briefly, in medical school, I got kind of depressed and ended up pursuing different things. My father was a psychiatrist, and I ended up exploring peyote, like sacred plant medicine ceremony in Arizona, where I'm from, and had a big kind of healing from that. And that heightened my interest in the ayahuasca that exists in South America and, known in Colombia as yahe, and the whole plant medicine tradition. So I wanted to try that one day, and I kind of made my way towards that over a few years. And then I got very involved. And in the interim, I did do some research in the Department of Psychiatry and Mind-Body Medicine, psychoneuroimmunology. That was a big influence on me. And but then, I went down to Peru and I started getting involved and got really involved. And I started helped co-found a healing center in Peru and worked there for years, and receiving people and putting them through traditional treatment from the Amazonian culture, the Shipibo culture, which involved a lot of plant medicine treatment and also ayahuasca ceremony. And so then I eventually came back, and I've been back in the States, and I've been involved in legalization of ayahuasca ceremony in the United States, and also research kind of that stemmed from the ideas from the book, the Epigenetics, looking at epigenetics as it's related to emotional trauma and the healing of emotional trauma. And so that connected me a little bit more to the psychedelic psychotherapy world here in the United States with, namely with MAPS, who's doing the MDMA assisted psychotherapy trial. So it's this interesting coming together of the two worlds. I think it is separate, the sacred plant medicine traditions, the ancestral traditions, and then what is psychedelic psychotherapy today. And they're, one kind of gave rise to one of them, and then now they're kind of learning from each other to a degree. And so I'm part of that. And the research that was inspired by our work in Peru, the Modern Spirit Epigenetics Project, assessing the MDMA's effects on epigenetics. Those results, the first set of results are almost, the final edits are being done on the paper, and it's going to be ready to be presented to the world. Yeah, we do believe that there is evidence of that kind of deep epigenetic change related to the emotional healing that people are going through and their clinical improvement.
Amazing.
Yeah.
Okay. So with that in mind, would you be happy to kind of introduce our listeners and kind of break down into layman's terms, both, I guess, epigenetics and what you mean by that, but also you mentioned a term earlier, psychoneuroimmunology, which I think obviously is a core part of this. And I would love to kind of try and unpack that a little bit if possible.
Yeah. Psychoneuroimmunology is a field that kind of came out of the mind-body research. So let's say people doing stress-related research. Why do people who are stressed out, have more illness, whether that's in their cardiovascular system or anywhere in their body? Their immune function may be compromised, because of stress-related things. So that the study of that has sorry, I got something in my throat this morning. Almost clear. The study of that has given rise to this like psychoneuroimmunology, or sometimes called psychoneuroendocrine immunology, which is describing this network that seems to be working in parallel with this mind-body system that's connecting your psychology, your thinking, all that, to your nervous system, to your brain and the autonomic nervous system that controls all this automatic function, right? A subconscious kind of expression of so many things inside of us. And the way that's dialed into your immune system and your hormonal system. So in the case, for example, of PTSD, where you see people with disturbances throughout this network, in tandem because of known trauma. We know they had major trauma. And then you see disturbance at the psychological level, at the autonomic nervous system level, all this, people are concerned about, heart rate variability and vagal tone and all that kind of discussion. And then the inflammatory disturbances in PTSD, and then even hormonal disturbances with fight or flight response, cortisol level problems, adrenaline problems. So that network, that system in tandem, that constellation, this psychoneuroimmunology, which in my book, I'm trying to put forth this idea that perhaps this is the emotional body that is described by, Ayurveda or Chinese medicine, other systems of medicine, because this is the system that you can show that is impaired by emotional trauma. And when emotional healing happens, the system improves its function. So that the example is the PTSD trial with the MAPS MDMA, very clear. We know what happened, whether it's some kind of abuse or war trauma or something. The system is disturbed at all these levels. And we know that disturbance, so we try to understand how those disturbances are like imprinted into the system. This emotional trauma, where would it be imprinted in the system? You can imagine some kind of memories or neuronal networks, but at the cellular level, is there evidence of the system being imprinted by strong experiences to be kind of a form of cellular memory? So one of the ways that could be is epigenetics. So epigenetics, the way I describe it is, you have the hardware of the DNA code that people have been very focused on for a long time. And then there's the software, which is the way that code can be coded in different kinds of little chemicals, or it's basically the ambassador, whatever is between that and the world. There's like biochemical machinery, that is determining perhaps, for example, how a gene is going to be expressed more or less, if it's marked in such a way that it would impair the expression of the gene or facilitate it or somehow alter it. So that would be the epigenetics. So that is so influential in biology, and we just didn't really know as much about it, previously, but it is, for example, why you have two cells that are of the same DNA exactly, like a neuron and a red blood cell, but they're very different cells. And it's because of the software, it's the programming. So they're imprinted in such a way that is stable, it's stabilized, the imprinting. So now it will continue to exist in that way, in that manner. Similarly, there's evidence for things like childhood trauma causing, changes, methylation changes along these genes, epigenetic changes that would imprint and then be stable. That the system perhaps is conserving that as a defense, as a protection, as some kind of like, oh, this is really significant. And so you have the adaptation. So that's the versatility of the system. The epigenetics represents the kind of nature versus nurture. Like here's an area that can adapt, that can change within the lifespan, but it's so core to the system that it might look genetic. You just say, well, that's how that person is. They're not going to change. It's so core to their function. And so you have that example with PTSD, where these certain genes related to the fight or flight, response, or the stress response system, things related to cortisol function, genes connected there are altered. They're affected. There's methylation. There's different ways these genes are imprinted biologically, altered, so that the gene doesn't function the same. The receptor isn't produced the same way. It is a little different functioning in response to the trauma. And that would lead to some kind of dysfunction of that system, or like we say, it's maladaptive. You want, you try to adapt, but over time, if the stress is too often and there's no room to repair, there's no avenue to return to the homeostasis, the system starts calibrating a little off,
Yeah.
starts functioning over here and doesn't have a way to get back. And because of the way some of the system works, some of that is stabilized. There's windows of development where things are more impressionable than others during certain periods of childhood. We see things like this attachment disorder, this kind of stuff where you could imagine adjusting to something and then kind of staying over here and then seeing lifelong kind of ripples from that early childhood trauma, in this example, affecting their biology to the point where you would say, well, that's just how they function. There's no way to decondition them, So this is conditioning. It's conditioning of the system, and it's the system's capacity to be conditioned beyond just what's in the DNA code. So you don't have to have natural selection to change, some biological trajectories. There's room within the lifespan to change quite a bit. And so how do you bring that back? And that's been a big question. And so there's reason to believe that because of the way people seem to be having these transformative healings with some of the sacred plant medicine ceremonies and with the psychedelic psychotherapies, that this may be facilitating some kind of epigenetic plasticity somehow. Whatever that is, the system is kind of ready to re-imprint, recondition, So there's some plasticity necessary that maybe the antidepressants and things like that, maybe they did facilitate that, when they find that psychotherapy by itself is only so effective, antidepressants by themselves only so effective together, they're more effective in helping people overcome this trauma, stress, conditioning that is limiting kind of their function. And so that's the theory, and that's the idea. And so that's why it's so relevant and important, because it's not just mental health, but mental health is a huge area for epigenetic discussion, with depression, anxiety, addiction, PTSD, for example. But then there's all this other, when in the functional medicine world, where you have, let's say, nutritional diabetes, diabetes type 2, adult onset diabetes, where people are developing this insulin resistance and have metabolic syndrome. Like, these are epigenetic phenomena. This is a system that wasn't working like that and now is working like that. And then some people are convincing those people, well, you won't be able to get that back. The ship has left whatever the dock. And then that turns out to not be true, right? The functional medicine people are saying, hey, wake up, wait a minute. That's not really how this works. The system can be deconditioned, but it's a process. So the nutrition, the lifestyle, but then the emotional interactions turn out to be very influential. Things like meditation and states of consciousness, very influential on the epigenetics, and the continued study of that kind of stuff. So, that's what I'm interested in. I propose, or we're into this idea of a little bit of like the metaphysics of it all. When you start getting into the psychedelic work or the sacred plant medicine work, then there are extra dimensional considerations, at least the experience of that.
Yeah.
Whatever that is, whatever that mystery is, but somehow that contact with the mystery or the openness that it kind of helps generate seems to be related to this whole thing. That the epigenetic plasticity, does a spiritual context like facilitate that? I would suggest that probably it does.
Yeah. I mean, you've explained that beautifully, and it kind of brings to mind two things, really. In my world, we often use terms like resiliency, allostatic load, and rigidity, yes, which are kind of it's the exact same principle that you're talking about here. Yes. How flexible is the system, or how capable is it of adapting to the environment, or has it become rigid, which has led to maybe a diagnosis of X, Y, or Z, ultimately anything.
Correct.
So that really kind of resonates. And the second thing is, I guess what you're saying there reminds me of Dr. Carhart Harris's kind of Rebus model or theory around how psychedelics relax our belief systems and it allows an opportunity for change and plasticity. Would you agree with that kind of a similar sort of principle? You're talking almost at a cellular or a subcellular level, where he was talking about just neurological, I guess.
Yeah, no, and it's really interesting, the multi dimensions of it. So I think, you know, his focus or their focus has been a little bit of the neural imaging, you know, not completely, but it's been extremely illuminating and interesting, and allows for so many other levels of the experience to be explored. So their idea is that, yes, there's this, like you were saying, in this allostatic load, you know, would be at one level looking at cellular physiological stuff, but in a brain, you could imagine like an over, you know, he talks about suppressing consciousness, like the ego suppressing consciousness and being able to kind of correlate that concept to the default mode network and the amount of like entropy that the brain is capable of, that the actual amount of, you know, physically, mathematically determined disorder, the capacity of the freedom of the system. And then this default mode network, certain kinds of connectivity would like suppress that freedom, but would also be linked to some of this rigidity that you're talking about, that perhaps like in a related fashion, certain kind of, what for me, the way I would think about it is, system is overwhelmed sometimes, like feeling too much, more voltage than it can handle. So it starts shutting off, you know, access to sources of, you know, too much energy, in a way like scarring, you know, scarring over, closing off doors, like I say, the mind turning off switches to the feelings and getting a little more self-contained and getting caught up perhaps in its own journey more and more. That you would, somebody with like a heavy trauma would be kind of, they say, frozen trauma, stuck in the past, you know, quick to be taken into flashback or replay of thinking they were there from this sensory input. Oh, that person's wearing a uniform. Oh my God, maybe I'm back in this military situation. You know, this sound is like a helicopter. Oh man, am I back in Vietnam? So that kind of narrow-minded, you know, rigid, like kind of has a tendency to go back to the same place in depressive patterns or fearful patterns, or let's say addictive, you know, I need this, I need that, that's what I need. So a lot of like a rumination and trapped, like they might say, like in the ego, in the mind, and then to be able to relax that. And when that relaxes, then as it does with meditation, or with in the psychedelics, when the person says, oh, well, their ego dissolved, well, they've been following along on the imaging, and they see this network really downshift its connectivity, its function. And when they do that, the person, you know, opens up to sensory experience from the outside world. So the filtration of that, you know, like in other words, the kind of walling off into that internal world. And now the senses are, overwhelming, as well as the interoception, you know, the feelings and the energy coming from the body. And along with that is a lot of emotional content, you know, a lot of emotional memory, a lot of maybe perhaps suppressed feelings, you know, from somewhere in there. And so then that experience is providing for, and, you know, there's another factor they started to explore, I think is really important, emotional breakthrough. That it's not just this mystical experience of how dissolved did they get, but did they achieve some kind of emotional breakthrough in that freedom that allowed for some kind of cathartic shift, which goes a lot closer to like the shamanic world of like, there's energy there that needs to be dealt with. There's energy that needs to be released. And perhaps this kind of closed mind is keeping that from happening. It's protecting itself, protecting you from whatever happened in the past, but it's not allowing this thing to go through this process that, like, you know, Peter Levine and somatic experience therapy is kind of going hand in hand, and they're approaching it from a very physiologic perspective of, this is what the system needs sometimes in a heavy trauma. It needs to have some kind of shakeout, catharsis, some kind of process, some something that a felt experience, needs to happen in order to, from the shamanic side, we'd say to dissipate that, to move past that, to discharge that. So, and then on top of everything else, when you do this and you get people's default mode networks down and get their egos dissolved, well, then a lot of them have mystical experiences, which is a whole other part of the package of, well, what happened there, and how did what happened there facilitate this other thing? And so all that going on at the neuronal level, the neuron network level, is then also reflected in the cells. Is our concept that it's like, okay, then at what point, in what moment does this white blood cell change the way the cortisol receptors are going to express themselves amidst that? So there is something holistic, that goes on. So we can look at it all the different levels. But in those different levels, there's things that happen across the system. And so it's important, both are extremely important in our understanding.
Yeah. And I think, it kind of goes down the systems biology concept of, as you say, it's all these systems are integrated. So I think the more holistic we can be, the better ultimately.
Yeah.
So yeah, no, I think that's amazing.
The more accurate, you know what I mean?
Yeah.
Yeah. I mean, you're not explaining to your left toe, what you're about to do. It doesn't work like that.
Yeah.
Yes.
Yeah. And I guess, in your book, you share each chapter is kind of a case study ultimately, where individuals have come to see you, they've done some ayahuasca ceremonies, and there are cases of things ranging from things like anxiety, but also I think there's one of a skin-based condition and inflammatory bowel disease, and these people are experiencing quite profound improvement through different means, through different periods of time. But would you be happy to share just a little bit around that side of things?
So I'm following along those lines. So then this, whatever is going on in these neuronal networks is also going on throughout the body, as we've said. And so when people are able to process out this trauma, that was previously inaccessible to them, or I don't, it's still kind of a mystery, but something like that. There's this, in the case of the psoriasis case, the inflammatory skin problem, was a chapter I used to introduce allostatic load, like in my book, that concept that I was really happy to see it come up in functional medicine and everywhere else, because in my little world, I had been exposed to that at the UCLA Center for East-West Medicine. So Chinese medicine, people studying, these guys are from Hong Kong, and they were trying to come up with concepts that were going to overlap to their concept. And they were allostatic load. They were studying that in terms of scleroderma, which is, it's a inflammatory condition across the body, but at our skin sequelae, there's skin effects in the disease. And so this idea of decreasing their allostatic load, to allow their system to function better, and that this allostatic load would be related perhaps to some threshold of like a flare in a psoriasis case. Somebody with skin inflammation, whether it's eczema or some kind of allergy or even psoriasis, that there's a threshold that they don't really have a bad flare. And then we know that stress for a lot of them is going to cause a bad flare. So then now we're exploring the resiliency of their system. So they have some genetic tendency perhaps to do this, to have this inflammation in their skin if their system is overtaxed in whatever direction the allostatic load factor. So is it emotional stress? Is it some allergic thing they're being exposed to? Is it environmental? Is it their diets? All these different factors. Is it environmental toxicity? And to what degree is it genetic? So all those factors playing together, and then this allostatic situation where you start to accumulate the stress, wear and tear on the system. And so now the threshold for the disease process, the pathology for the skin to plaque up and become problematic becomes just a lot easier, stable. Now they're having, it doesn't go away and it gets worse frequently. So, the shamans would talk about that as like the accumulation of the energy. That you have this, no, they haven't done the cleaning, they haven't de-escalated the situation to bring back the resiliency of the system, the resiliency of the system would demonstrate itself. Whereas now, maybe if they had a big stress, they might have a little flare, but not a big, huge flare. Their body wouldn't react so strongly. So in studying how in psoriasis, how this comes to be, one of the concepts is this neurogenic inflammation, that the nerves themselves, the inflammation on the skin is not happening in response to some kind of bacteria or external factor or injury. It's coming from the nervous system itself. Like in that chapter, it was her experience, and it's not like always the case, but this idea of her body, crying for help. The body says no, some kind of the nervous system is saying, something's wrong. And so then what is that something wrong? How do we approach that? And so it's the psychoneuroimmunology of psoriasis. So tracking, they've articulated all these little molecular network pathways of how such a thing could happen, how the stress could lead to this body effect. But then it's like, what do we do to bring the threshold down, to get the resiliency back? And then it's like, well, it's decreasing the emotional burden on that individual. And so it's taking the time. In her case, it was extended, it's extensive time in the jungle and outside of the jungle. She was somebody that her only real skin clearing that she had previously had after going vegan, doing all the leaky gut diet, everything that you're supposed to do, functional medicine, nutritional, nothing really did it for her. The only thing that cleared it up one time was a Vipassana meditation. She did a 10-day sit, had a complete clearing of her skin. That was the first time. So then that just indicates, okay, well, what is that? And the dietary, the nutritional, wasn't doing it in her case. Sometimes it does, it's worthwhile. In this case, it did not. So then how is she going to get at this thing where it responds to deep meditation practices, spiritual practices, and then also like this experience in the jungle, where she was doing all this emotional processing through her plant diets, through the ayahuasca ceremonies. And then she had a similar, response. And then in a prolonged, like I said, she may have a little bit of a flare, but not as before. And in a hope and a pathway of, that can also get reel this back in. The inflammatory bowel case, similarly, I found research around neurogenic inflammation being underlying Crohn's disease. That the biopsy showed, and all this research, that this neurogenic inflammation, similarly neurogenic inflammation related to migraine headache, that in the vascular system, this neurogenic inflammation. So again, the possibility of some psychological emotional burden, revving the system up, getting into some kind of allostatic calibration, that now the wrong stress push them over the edge, into, could be a smell for the migraine, the light, the sound. Now they can't tolerate, the resiliency is not there for them to go through normal experiences. In the Crohn's disease, they say that some of these people have, because of the inflammatory process going on in their guts, this hypersensitivity to pain. That in some cases, when they send a little ball through their system, that not every time, but in some cases, they're being stretched out as much as anybody else, but it's just so painful for them.
Yeah.
So we have this threshold, we have this resiliency on top of then the inflammation and the ulceration of the mucosa of the lining getting damaged and bleeding and causing pain and diarrhea. So then you have a guy go there, and I talk about that case in the book. His first treatment was like 3 weeks. And he was somebody that also, when you read about Crohn's disease, that's understated a lot of times, and maybe in functional medicine too, but definitely in family medicine, that there's a high comorbidity with psychological issues. That's very common, that there's depression or anxiety or something. And so that people don't explore, trauma history or childhood adverse events, all that kind of stuff, that perhaps, that's really missing the boat. So in his case, turns out he was very depressed when he showed up borderline suicidal, but then also was revealed like the heavy abuse that he suffered, physically, sexually, and the kind of profound processes that he had to go through on top of just all kinds of cathartic, energetic purge with ayahuasca and all that kind of thing. but also like, deep forgiveness processes for his father, for his stepfather, for an aunt that abused him, and kind of going through healing around all of that. And then he has this dramatic improvement that is, I haven't talked to him in a little while, but I mean, for a couple of years afterwards, he had a very pronounced resolution, going from bloody diarrhea all day long and wanting to kill yourself to I'm not depressed, and I get a little stomach gurgling when I had to go to my child's custody, battle in court. It's like, well, okay, that sounds normal.
Yeah.
Right. So it's that idea of this, how do we improve this resiliency in these cases? And so then that's what, my interest in the book is about this. Okay, well, let's explore the emotional side. And then once we start exploring the emotional side, there's an emotional biology related to that, and there's a somatic experience of that emotional biology. And then it turns out there's even epigenetics. I mean, there's biochemistry involved. So how do you address that? And, then you see this meditation, this Vipassana retreat is making a big difference, or these plant medicine with all the spiritual context in which we worked on in Peru. It's like the spiritual context, tricky in this modern world to work toward, as so many people are set off by it. But this idea of at least something that is going to embrace the mystery, that's going to open the realm of possibilities. And then from that place, beyond judgment, that's safe, where the person is kept very, very safe, and where they can be vulnerable, beyond, where you might expect somebody to feel vulnerable in a clinical situation. Like they're going to have to get more vulnerable than that to get at it. So then how do you create a setting to hold somebody through that? So the psychedelic psychotherapy is, they're doing that. So sitting there with the MAP study, hovering over somebody while they're on a couch, listening to music for 6 to 8 hours. It's that's way past the average therapeutic experience, even without the substance.
Right.
That's one of the big epigenetics trauma researchers who's getting involved with MAPS, Rachel Yehuda. She was saying that, when she started observing their work, just realizing, oh my God, look what happens at the second hour. Look what happens at the third hour. Look what happens at the fourth hour. Like there's an area there that we're not really getting to that, in these brief visits. And so then you see then in the ancestral culture, the idea of these prolonged retreats and prolonged ceremonial experiences that's kind of what it takes, for you to get at some of this stuff. Here in Arizona, I say sometimes in traditional Navajo ceremonies, not a lot, but a few, that they don't use any substance in these traditional ceremonies, but you stay up all night, with prayer and song. So by 3 a.m, 4 a.m, a lot of people start opening up in ways in front of their families that they wouldn't have done at 8:30 p.m. Simple. It's simple and it's true. We've all experienced that. So it's that's what it's about. That to get this resiliency back up, to bring down the allostatic load and reduce this kind of threshold, how do we unburden the system if we know that the emotional burdening is part of it?
Yeah.
And what kind of space do people need to do that realistically? Like, not, the proof is in the pudding. We're not just saying blah, blah, blah. It's like, well, they did it over here and they didn't do it over here. So that's what we're talking about. And that's what's happening. And I think that's the psychedelic psychotherapy world is opening that door. And then, it's also shining a light on the ancestral cultures from which it evolved that are, more and more opening up their experience about how to be there with people through those experiences,
Yeah, I think, I re-emphasizing that point, which is especially, I think, when there has been trauma, or even just, let's describe it as high level stress over many years in different circumstances. We we build our barriers and we show up in certain ways. And as you say, it's kind of, we need to lighten that burden, but doing so is very scary, I think, for a lot of us.
Yeah.
You know, being vulnerable is very scary. And I remember my first ever psychedelic experience, there was huge amounts of kind of anxiety and fear in that first half hour until I kind of managed out a way to let go and surrender, as they say, to the experience. And
Yeah.
it was interesting to reflect on how, for me, I think that kind of mirrors how I was day to day in regards to trying to control and, you know, struggling to let go in my day-to-day life. And it's really interesting, I think, how these things often are kind of lessons in regards to how we're showing up in life sometimes.
Yeah, and I think that exactly what you described is a huge factor in kind of the resistance to exploring this high stress trauma, because it requires a vulnerability that is not welcome in the levels of higher performance in the society. For example, academics, healthcare providers, and then, then the corporate world. So if performing well in those areas where those people are the leaders in what's happening in healthcare, and they don't feel comfortable getting vulnerable, so it's hard to bring the discussion of the emotional content forward. That's what I say. We have to be compassionate to the reality of the brokenheartedness of what ends up looking like arrogance. It's arrogance, it's guarded pride, and it's not letting. And so it's like, so then the truth is, what you're seeing is a society and a person who's just never been held in that kind of vulnerability. Because when they do get held in that kind of vulnerability safely and are cared for, and are not judged, pretty much every time, very high likelihood they're going to come out of it more open-minded and more open-hearted.
Absolutely. I mean, I'm as we said off air at the beginning, I'm training in transformational breath work at the moment, and I've kind of had the privilege of having
not with Elif, are you? No, my friend Elif is in London.
Yeah, I'm hoping to attend her seminar because it's next month, isn't it?
She's a good friend. Yeah.
So I've had the privilege and luxury of having 3 separate weeks of transformational breath, and I think on all 3 weeks there were 6 participants, there were 6 facilitators, and it's just the most beautiful transformational experience. You see people's facial expressions, their eyes change as they kind of let go into that safe container, and let go of emotions that they've been holding on to for years without realizing it. And I can certainly put my hand up. I've obviously had the exact same experiences.
Yeah.
And it's beautiful. I think, I know that all the research sort of indicates that psychedelics aren't addictive, but I kind of joke that experience, that kind of living in commune of witnessing and being witnessed in our vulnerability, for me, kind of is addictive, because I think it's how we're meant to be.
Yeah. Well, I think that the transformational breathwork is a great example of how, you can access this kind of work in these states. And there's many other ways, and whether that's a somatic experience therapy, so many different ways that people achieve this kind of stuff. And so it's just a matter of balancing it out, where you can find this. I think the way to argue for it, instead of the kind of, there's a self-righteousness sometimes that comes out of the discovery of this stuff, that self-righteous energy that turns people off, and then they say, oh, look, you're preaching to me about this, and who wants to be preached to? Nobody. And so I think it's wiser for me to keep the discussion around health and say, like, look what transformational breathwork can do for people's health. Like this person, so that the health is the guiding, that the health ultimately, I believe, will lend itself to this kind of more, this universal love and things that you're describing, But in order for people to kind of go consider that, it's easier to walk them through, and it's also kind of true that this path of healing and this allostasis and this trying to increase the resiliency, like, yeah, it turns out they keep bumping into each other. Like, oh, more gratitude practices, increase resiliency, you know? So there's something about the connection that nourishes the system. You know, I think that's like this metaphysical component that it's like, okay, we don't have to, that's what people are gonna, it's too woo-woo for them, you know, they have to experience it. Fine, they have to experience it. But on the road toward this idea of the path of healing is the same as aligning ourselves with the sacred. That's an indigenous kind of belief. And so rather than just push this kind of the morality or whatever it is that maybe people are going to disagree on, it's just like, well, let's just talk about the health. Let's just get your cells working better. You know, watch, if we do this, like, it's, the system is integral, as mentioned. And so the more it's integrated, the more, you know, the less trouble you're going to have, the more resiliency you're going to have, the more increase the quality of your life. And then the rest is kind of revealed, you know, amongst each other, with each other, bit by bit. So just allowing the organic kind of part of it. So then, you know, putting health first, I think is a way to find a universal spirituality.
Beautiful. I love that. And that concept of connectivity seems to be a big theme that comes up for me a lot at the moment. And obviously, again, there are lots of ways that we can do that, but it's finding whatever tools are available to us to kind of nourish and nurture that concept of connectivity with self, others, and the planet.
Yeah. And like being able to use this psychoneuroimmunology as kind of an indicator of maybe when things aren't working so well. It's like, oh, look over here, you've got this inflammatory disturbance, you've got this, I mean, there's genetic components, but maybe that's not healthy. You know, maybe that closed-mindedness is going to be hard on your immune system. Maybe the closed-heartedness is going to be hard on your, you know, autonomic nervous system.
Yeah.
So those, it becomes you know, they become more factual, you know, as far as it's like that of the wisdom.
Yeah, I sometimes think that in the Western world, you know, it's the science can sort of attract a certain type of person into the conversation that can then morph, and we can start to bring in some of the wisdom and the spirituality. You know, it's kind of helping people bite at the topic, so to speak.
That's it. And I think the truth is probably is you're getting them to bite at their belief system because the belief system is really wrapped up in this emotional body. And so they're like intertwined. When you challenge somebody's belief system, they have emotional response, including science, you know. And so when you trash their science, like as I say, because I get involved in these discussions where they have these materialists versus the immaterialists or all these different perspectives. And my point is that there's a point at which the materialist, you know, they take their leap of faith and they just believe, well, everything will be explained by materialism, even that which has not yet been. That is a religious fervor, you know, despite the evidence they have for everything they have up to that point, but still there's a leap beyond that where it's like, okay, well, that's where I'm talking about, is that's the area that, you know, we're here practicing the shamanism over here, and it's kind of out of the bounds of what you've described so far. So now we're just competing beliefs. You say you're right, you say I'm wrong, and that's really as far as it is gone in the thinking. And so, and I respect that because I know that's a delicate place for all of us. You know, as you said, we started getting out of our comfort zones. So trying to be, you know, compassionate and if there is some, it should have a material correlate. You know, why wouldn't it in the integrated system? So admittedly, okay, well, it's hard to find it. It's hard to pick. It's hard to, you know, study it, capture it, measure it. But then that's what's exciting about the epigenetics research,
right?
You know, because we're saying, hey, this is kind of like where this spiritual, emotional world is touching the flesh.
Mm.
It just made the difference,
Yeah.
and have connection to universal love seemed to be profoundly impactful on this person's biology. And so it's a meeting in the middle, the two. Like we respect the skepticism. It's good as long as it's not overly arrogant and guarding
Yeah.
a broken heart that's going to just leave us in the wound.
Yeah.
So at the same time, so open-hearted, they're just unbounded optimism, foolishness. That's what they're worried about, and then the charlatanism that can sprout from that. So it's like, okay, you have the open heart, but is it grounded? Does it hold water? And so then that's the meeting of the heart and the mind, which is where we're at with the science and the culture. There's so many opportunities for that. And psychedelic psychotherapy is right there, as well as the plant medicine.
Yeah.
So it's an exciting time for humanity in that sense, despite what's going on.
Really well said. I love the concept of a really open yet grounded heart. I think that there is beautiful. I'm mindful of time, Dr. Tafur, but I wonder if maybe just for 3-4 minutes even, I'm putting you on the spot and asking you a huge question and giving you 3 minutes to answer. But I'm kind of curious, what might come to mind if we think about sort of this psychedelic renaissance? And there are 2 questions here. You don't have to necessarily answer both, but I'm curious if you have any concerns and what your kind of, I guess, your hopes and your vision are for how this will move forward.
Yeah, I think there's so many aspects to it and so many elements. So right now in the United States, for example, there's a big saying about the venture capital, and everybody wants to move in, and they're just gonna expand it out and franchise it or scale it up. And I just think that is interesting, and we'll have to see how that plays out. And I can understand wanting to meet the need, but I think that it's so personal, this work. And so my father was a psychiatrist, grew up around mental health. The franchising of mental health hasn't really worked at all anywhere. Even the rehabs can't seem to maintain that many locations. So I think that there's going to be an organic side to this, and that there should be, and that no matter what the investment is or where the forces that are trying to get involved in the activity, there still be the care that will determine, for each person involved, whether or not this is effective. Number one. Number two, the ancestral cultures do have a lot to share and experience of dealing with this kind of stuff, whether that is also like opening realms, people having experiences on ketamine where they're having supernatural experiences. I heard someone was channeling some kind of message for the other person, for the therapist. And they were kind of terrified by the entire experience. But those kind of things, like mystical phenomena that can happen, it's there. The DMT research, Rick Strassman, they said that at the end of their research, well, we kind of stopped it because we realized we were opening things that we didn't know what we were doing. So just that there's something to be said for that. And all the ancestral cultures talk about that. So then it's about developing relationships with them, respecting them, finding ways to have some kind of reciprocity with them so that they would be inclined to share their experience. So we had a group, these 2 Colombians were on a talk I gave the other day, or I was translating for them. And they said something very beautiful along the self-righteousness talk, as far as the experience. They said, well, here's a little tip from our culture that is built upon the lessons that we learned from our connection to this mystical space that you're reaching into. Said, if this substance or this practice is making you feel bigger than or more than, it's not working. Like, it should be feeling more integral to the larger. So that it would be a simple, little piece of wisdom coming down from them. They're so useful. in this world, where so much ego has been, has been an issue around the psychedelic movement. But yeah, so those are my 2 comments for now.
Yeah, no, that's amazing. I think it really resonates. The training I'm doing at the moment, they're very much encouraging us to deeply reflect on our why. Why do we want to kind of enter that space? And it's been an interesting journey so far. And I think there's an alignment with conventional medicine. There is I would say, a big ego in conventional medicine and kind of why people go into it sometimes. So it's, being incredibly aware of kind of our intentions ultimately. So thank you for sharing that.
Yeah.
I know you've got a call coming up. So Dr. Tafur, it's been a real honor. I've loved listening to you. So thank you very much.
Thank you. Thank you for having me on. Yeah, I have a good friend in London, and Ed lives in London. My cousin moved to London, so it's fun. It's fun to connect. Thank you, Alex.
Thank you.